he was not able to relate relate to the people that he was assisting. The fourth Baratas.
Museum that come about Haina. Otherwise, quite memory winer. 15 Japanese army quite a Marathagan, Kalipartu, active ever come
use his microphone.
Japanese army. 15 Japanese army, she Yam Kanbashe Mokai division ahum La Pashita 15 quite a strongest army. I don't know. Makwaina Permaki elephant 200 paraga Shangshak. I'll take it. Churchlaga, a Kalatompi. I'll take it. A quite more powder Mokina. Evolution Kitama. Adoga Russian ki Keriki Loy Punaba Atu Taraga. Kushi when the talking about elephant singado.
So there are 200 elephants that the 15th Japanese Army gathered and they were marching them on, carrying ammunition. Now, I mean, here is a first-hand account, and then we have the immediacy of his memories. Emma, as a person from England, what kind of reverberations of World War II to our generation were there that you felt when you were growing up? Did you hear about Manipur or the Battle of Impal ever?
Certainly not, and I think what's been said today is quite right, that we were so focused only on what was happening in Europe, and then maybe after Pearl Harbor what was happening in the Pacific, although for British even the Pacific history was very poorly addressed. So no, what was happening over here was not particularly known, although I have to say two personal stories, which was that my mother was part of the war as a member of SOE, which is the Special Operations Executive, and she spent her war in what was then Ceylon in radio contact with people, British soldiers in Burma. So I was always very much brought up with this. I personally did have quite an idea of what was going on here. And then a little later, when I met the man who eventually became my husband, he was part of a British regiment, which is now the Scottish Dragoon Guards, but which at that time was the Carbineers, and they, of course, had a huge purpose in the war in Impal and were present at Natchugong, which I am going to pronounce incorrectly.
And what is your personal...
I have been in India quite a long time, and I have travel connections with India going back now many years. So it's always been a country that's inspired me, and the thing about India is you never stop discovering it and new parts of it and new areas. It's not a country, it's a continent, and all those other cliches. But the Northeast was always, I've been to Assam quite a lot early in my life of knowing India. And then I read a book. I met some and I read a book that which was about her mother, which was a typical strong Edwardian lady who had come from the Naga Hills in the 30s and lived here.
Ursula Bowers.
And that was Ursula Bowers. And any books, on her, the V company were talked about today as well. And she was for the British, was very important in the V company because she was one of the few people that knew the Nagas, and it was a big part of the British war history that they had no idea what the Northeast was going to do in the war. They had there was no reason for, Nagaland and Manipur and this area to support the British. They didn't consider themselves part of British India at all. And it was quite possible, and as indeed, the story went both ways, that the Japanese would have more influence. So people like Ursula, and there were others that, Pawsey, who was the I with the sort of personal understanding of this part of the war and how I came to it. But what I've since found is that anybody, tourists that come to Kohima and come to Nagaland, although they probably come for a different reason, once you have been to Kohima and you see the war cemetery there, and you get even the littlest bit of history, it kind of opens up this whole area as being completely fascinating and so important. I mean, we actually were, last year, we're talking about the anniversary this year. Last year was the anniversary at the end of the war in Europe, which people were very much celebrating. And I have to say, my mother was marching around going, but this wasn't the end of the war. And I mean, and that, that year, 44, was when Kohima, and it was at its worst in this part of the world. And that has, been forgotten. And I think it's very important that it's not forgotten and should be brought to people's attention.
I'm going to address my next question too, but in the meantime, could you bring up the lights in the auditorium, please, a little bit? Because we're going to be opening up the conversation to those of you in the audience who have so kindly come this afternoon. Yambong, yes, and there is a microphone. Does someone have a microphone? Mr. Shishak was relating this very interesting anecdote about M.K. Priyabarta and his conversation with him, talking about whose war it was. So, could you add a little bit more about the Manipuri response? Whose war was it?
To answer, because we were not part of them, and so what should I say? We were living in the 19th century, because we hardly know the outside world. Very few people have traveled outside. The number of educated people is less than 5%. So people just don't bother, I think, during those days. Even though the elite were supporting the British, there are some people from the Moirang side, where the INA had penetrated, supported the Japanese. But I want to make a small clarification of what Mr. Shishak has mentioned. He was mentioning Kali Bahadur Regiment again and again, which fought in the Battle of Sangshak, in which in the Rajeshwar list is also there. It's a regiment from the Nepal, and Kali Bahadur was the man who led it. He was a younger father-in-law of the then Maharaja of Manipur, Bodhichandra, who is Kali Bahadur is the uncle of Ishwari Maharani. And they had got a very, very good name in Manipur because of their valor, of their bravery, and many of the battles in which they fought, they come out with great honor. So people, older generations still talk about the Kali Bahadur Regiment, which is basically from the Royal Nepal Army. But coming back to Somi's question, see, before the bombing, nobody bothered. See. Only when bombing started in Chengamon, Mantov, a large number of people died. And when this bomb went to Kangla, where the Fort Assam rifle was staying, and then in the residency, which is now Rajbhavan, then people suddenly woke up that something big is happening. Otherwise, people were just not bothered about this war. Because the newspaper came very late, there was no TV like it is nowadays, so news traveled very slowly. And in fact, as Raghu has mentioned, the siege of Kohima was never brought out even in England. So people in England do not know what is happening. So when the siege is lifted, and when this was flashed, that the English just do not know what is this. Kohima is under us, and how can this be relieved? That was the reaction even in those days. There was tremendous censorship was there. That is what I have learned from my uncle. Because nothing, every letters which comes out, even to the families and all, are censored. They put black ink over the censored portion. So from the army side also, they ensure that news doesn't leak out. But for Manipur, generally from what I have heard from my parents and from my elders is that generally people from the Imphal area is more supportive of the British side, and whereas people from the Moirang side are more supportive of the Japanese. Then most of the Nagas are supportive towards the British, and quite a number of Kukis are supportive towards the INA. Because if you see the list of Tamarapatra awardees, you will hardly find any Naga names, but you will find a long list of Kuki names. What we were told is that Mr. T.S. Harp, who was then at one time the president of the Manipur State Darbar, who joined a war effort to go underground, he was killed somewhere in this Kangchup site on information given by the Kukis informers to the Japanese. So he was killed, and his body could never be recovered. So one thing what I have learned from the memoir written by the British officer is that many of the ICS officers serving in India volunteered to intelligence gathering work. Our last political agent, G.P. Stewart, in his book, The Rough and the Smooth, also mentioned about his capture. He was an ICS officer, but he went in Malaysia, and he was gathering information. He was captured, and he was kept as a prisoner of war till the end of the war. So many of those British officers are so dedicated. So if you ask me, say, any of our IS officers now to go underground and collect information, I think 90% will say, I will quit the service. But these people are so dedicated that they went underground, people have died. And I have gone through this book, The Rough and the Smooth by G.P. Stewart, our last political agent, and he was there for a very long time as a prisoner of war in Malaysia, in the Malay Peninsula. So, by and large, I think the Manipuri people are more supportive of if you do the balancing, I think they are more toward the British.
Thank you, everybody. Sure. My heartiest congratulations to Raghu Karnad, who have come all along from here for releasing this Farthest field books. It's very interesting about the narration also. Here, I have not the questions to interact, but I have a very fascinating story to tell about the gruesome Second World War in Irengbam village that is about 3 kilometers away from Red Hills. That is my opposite. And this story has some manifold sites of the Second World War among the villages. So, can I will take only 2 minutes time. Can I start now, sir?
Did you want to see us tell a story?
A little
bit about your family.
Yes. When the Second World War was on its last leg, the monsoon was at its best. The Japanese was out of food, and they have to at the night time, not at the daytime. At the night time, they have go to the local houses for some morsels of the food. And among the maites, in the cooking pot, we have 2, 3, 4 pots of some we call it chako. That is only few round grains, so that if any latecomers comes and asks for food, that is for that kind of food. And by the time in the early morning, some Japanese soldiers, they were hungry, and they shoot down a local cow of a local people. And that person, he was an expert of the local wrestling that is called Manipuri called Mungna. So without caring nothing, he charged to the Japanese army, and he just grappled one of them, and that was thrown on the ground, and his knees was on the breast of the dead person within a second. And very interestingly, there was the barrels and the barrels of the guns up, down, side, the officer. He was surrounded by soldiers within minutes. Then the officer said, "Go away." And then, and after that incident, they killed the cow and they turned it, and they left the people there. And after about 60 years, the Japanese who came here to identify the bones of their dead soldiers, they have requested for identification of that particular person. They identified that house according to a map born by them. They just identified with the help of these trees, we call it Sanakonang, in English it is called banyan tree, local map, and they exactly identified that house. They said, bring anybody come, please bring anybody inside this house. And somebody come, no. If anybody remains, no. And the last time they bring out one very, very old person, yes, this is the person. They say, this is the person. Then the officers asked, do you remember an incident which happened during a World War? There was a battle for your cow. You put down one man on the ground and the guns are surrounded you. And then suddenly you go away. Do you remember? By the time the man was on the last leg of his life. He said yes. Just turning his head. And then the officer said, I was the commanding officer. I was the commanding officer. That was during the wartime. I have no money. Now I have come just to pay the price of your cow. To pay the price of your cow. How much you want for your cow?
Thank you, thank you.
The man said
Raghu,
no.
I think this is probably the...
Mr. Shishak once told me a similar meeting he had during the war and then much later with a very interesting figure named Lieutenant General Iwaichi Fujiwara. It began when, as he said, he was working as a peon and a runner for the 4th Marathas. But then his luck changed and he was captured by a Japanese patrol. And I think he should say what happened next.
Fujiwara nang British pion toba do yaroi han e puga tore. Adamana
Fujiwara said you cannot be a peon for the British or they'll beat you up.
Adamana ebu e gimeteng krapango han eti ukru area the any pion oikrabani.
So instead help us and say become a peon in the Ukrul area.
Last di mana shangse and came ama 3,000 labor Chaka the man a Burakre. And the last day, Mr. Shisha, after Second World War, she loeraga. And nang bukawni. Nang angang nang kumbado amata shulete. Ayam nung she hana mana last sayonara hana. Told the Aishu company, Marshu company. I'll think Japan. Hiroshima da ebo space pinaba ena ebo mana pachano welcome tauraga Hiroshima da challe.
Want to translate that or should I?
Ma ekwaloi na Japan singa she ekwai ka mokwaloi na kapa amale maramti hochi ekwai na ngam na ba lakpani do ngam tre ekwai supply later. No way nationality, power nationality has the cha later. Russian what create aduna ekram the quay hosidi halake.
We are going to leave now because we've run out of ammunition and arms. We've even run out of food before we're going to be retreating, was what Fujiwara said.
Aduna 18 April da aina pairiba she. Aina pairiba mashe concrete ke yamna atomba ching aduda flag ashe man yungmani yunglaga V force haina mukai partition tukai pire aduna ashti pamwe aina khunglaga e yumda hoshure hosishu e gidale.
The Japanese established a camp in concrete, and this flag was unfurled by the Japanese. But the P-Force came and destroyed the camp, and this flag was collected by Mr. Shishak, and it is still there with him now.
What you have later me? Adam Kwai, 1972 the Fujiwara and 32 army, ex-army Shingedo. In part of Europe.
There were 32 ex-army people who came in 1972 with Fujiwara.
Ado mana ebo habidi nang laktawiyate la o nang unaninge haina jetpakanda.
So you have to come. I want to meet you. The message came to me.
Appointment Petre.
And but he not.
Haina.
You cannot meet him.
Nungaide to the HLKN.
All right,
Kohimada. Inauripai yung the Lerga cemetery, Kwema War Cemetery, at the Kwetun Labor Kanda, Makwai party in party La Eva.
So he was at the war cemetery when the war party showed up, the visiting party.
Adoina, Mashi Fuchwara, Yobra have the.
Is Fujiwara here?
Ya, Fuchara Krambono Harga, Iwachi Fuchwara,
Which Fujiwara? Iwachi Fujiwara, he said.
Edi Magi, Pioni
He
Harga.
used to be his peon.
Tuna Kauro.
Call him quickly.
In Pada, Kigi Unatabunaria.
Why didn't you meet him in Impal?
Mashanungai Tabiki Unatre.
Oh, he was not feeling well, so I
I
didn't
think
meet him.
Adona Mana, Aya, and Mana, able Lupa, dishing a home.
You gave it-
Cup tuna. Adona Mana able hide. Matati Yam Nungade, Ado Nang Chilashe in part that again, Agam Kranare to the Echapayaro Hayatuna. At the day, Schweidana Hiroshima, Nagasaki, a product to be a day, Nang Yo Trabina Wushua Yaro Haina, Pakipara Crash Shaduna, a 1980, no, 1997, a Nagasaki, Ado Hiroshima, the HLA.
So he said, he gave him, then he said, let's go back to Impal. He says, no, I can't come, I have other things to do. So he said, instead he invited to Hiroshima. So they still refused to pick him up.
And a collection over Top Marie Naktani, Minipurta Lands of Washe. Top Marie do egg yum that come to the Pajan labor can. Atuda Amunga the SPSFK is better Equaye Amana Lauraga Paleta Tame. Atuga Adu Bureau Harashu Ya Te Kahire.
Masih kanogi Fujiwara unabada pabong masih mana.
Initiation. You could take this out and we could promote Manipur more. We got a lot more to show.
Reality. I mean, there are cases where it isn't. It is a problem that lots of not lots, but other areas have. I mean, Kashmir is another one in point that actually the British Foreign Office currently have an advisory out not to go to Kashmir, or you can go to Srinagar but not to Gulmarg. Well, excuse me, what is the issue in Gulmarg? As you know, hundreds of domestic tourists go there. It is a problem of perception. Actually, Nagaland, Manipur, the northeast, even Assam is linked together, and people will see an incident, particularly in Assam, in the areas of Assam where there's unsettled troubles, and that will stop the whole of the Assam tourism. But I don't think it's insurmountable, and I think I often use the Sri Lanka as an example, that throughout the Tamil War, Sri Lanka actually grew its tourism hugely. And it never actually, I don't really understand why, but it was people's perception. They wanted to go to Sri Lanka enough, or they thought the Tamil problems were in the north and they were going to the south. So I think it is surmountable. Of course, for you, any Manipuris as a whole, you want a peaceful country. But I definitely think that people are working to get tourists here. If they come to Nagaland, there is absolutely no reason why they can't come through. The story, Kohima is not the story. The story is Kohima and Imphal and indeed the road into Burma. And I would like to see, the Moray, the Burma crossing open further, and that would complete the whole story, of which Manipur would be very central to the complete story. So, hopefully going forward, things here improve for you, will improve for everybody. It is a problem of perception, but India, it happens elsewhere in the world, and you just have to keep on persevering, and hopefully, with an active tourism department, with people like myself actually bringing people here, people going back and telling stories, then hopefully we can improve the situation. Because I think Manipur, forgetting the military history, the small amount I've seen so far, has so much to offer.
Called Ningombam Tomba Singh. He was usually dealing with some sort of Kwamana Yonba, like small business, and during 30s he just went for the business, but he never returned. And without his dead body, he was cremated in the home. Rituals were performed in the house without his dead body. He never returned home. He was killed in the war, and his brothers who are now living, he told that he was killed in the war, and that's a part of the story. And one thing is, my grandfathers, they grew up loitering, playing around in fields in the Foizing village, which is the place where Korifava lies. They told that during the war, the battle was fought between Japanese and the British. The British were on the hill of Korifava, and the Japs were in the Maivam hills, and they were firing. Firings were happening between the two. And my grandfathers, they dug up some comb, pits, and they hid inside those dug up places, fearing from the bullets and bombs that may come up. They might not have protected them, but they thought that they would be safe inside dug up pits, and they were hiding inside those dug up places. And one interesting thing is, when the firing stopped, they used to use trucks. Not trucks exactly, I don't know, but some huge pile of oranges which were thrown out by the Britishers, which were not eatable, like patlava komla sing. Though the grandfathers, their colleagues were finding it very tasty and loitering around eating those rotten oranges and fruits which were already thrown out by these things, goras, and they were enjoying those during that time. That's all. That's my memories narrated by my grandfather in my childhood, and he is still there, 93 years old. Thank you. Thank you.
And Yamuk Nimai has also referred to how thrilling the book is. Can you just tell us a little bit about the literary style of your book? Because you tell us what you're thinking. How did you evolve this, and what was the process of your developing your literary take on this?
Right after the war concluded, and unfortunately, a lot of it is quite difficult to read, and it isn't going to hold the interest of lay readership. So that's one of the reasons that these stories have fallen apart. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to write this story, and I wanted it to appeal to people who like to read novels, people who like reading fiction. And I started writing this book. My first attempt was to write a novel. But when I did that, I realized A, that writing fiction is very difficult, and B, that the real events that took place in their lives and the real events that took place in the country were much more unexpected, and I could never do justice to them. What I could invent would never do justice to what had actually happened. So there was no point in my inventing anything. So it had to be non-fiction. But the truth is, the questions that are raised by the Indian participation in the Second World War are very subtle questions. They're subjective questions. Why fight for one side or the other? How do you choose your loyalty? Do you choose loyalty or do you choose freedom? And the answers to those questions are not necessarily to be found in bald fact. And therefore, I had to allow myself a license, a certain liberty, to go into the minds of my characters. And I called it forensic non-fiction, or a forensic license, because the way I saw it was, I had these three men. I didn't really know who they were. I didn't know how they had got to where they ended up. But I had to track them, I had to find out. It was sort of a detective job. And the answer is a case that I'm making. I wouldn't never call this a biography, any more than I would call it an academic treatment of the Second World War. But it's my story. It's the case that I'm making for what really happened and what happened in the minds of Indians caught in that conflict. So everything that is rendered in the physical world, including dialogue, by the way, their movements, the events of their lives, the assignments and the kind of engagements of the units, all of that is completely fact, down to the detailing of the environment and so on. But what's seen through their eyes, what happens in their minds, their thoughts and their emotions and the questions that assail them are things that I took the liberty to write in, because I don't think that it's fiction even then. I didn't invent any of it. A lot of it was suggested by the material, and I just took and I just interpreted it and placed it where I thought it belonged.
And was included in an anthology from Zuban Book some years ago. And so we work in any field that my mother was involved in, including film and theater and music and environmental issues and women's issues and internationalism and so on. So we look forward to having you here with us again. We again reiterate our sorrow at the departure of our late governor, His Excellency Syed Ahmed. And but I'm very glad that we're able to join us today for this very special occasion. So I thank everyone, especially our wonderful MC, Dhaneshwari Devi in the back, the voiceless people, and as well as the wonderful volunteers led by Pawan and Jenny. Thank you very much, and you've been wonderful. And,
thank you,
and of course, thank you to MFDC for extending all the hospitality of this auditorium. And with that, without further much ado, please join us in the lobby, and you can have any other questions, any kind of interactions with Emma, or Yambu, or Raghu, or Mr. Shisha out in the lobby. So thank you again for coming today. Good night.